Pepple Lecture and to do four things. The first is to extend a sincere appreciation to Dr. and Mrs. Pepple for this opportunity to attend this wonderful lecture series. The second is to encourage anyone here who is not currently a member of the Friends of the Boatwright Library to please join us in all of the activities that we have planned for the rest of the year. The third thing I'd like to do this evening is to invite everyone to join us at a reception following the lecture, the reception will be in Keller Hall across the street. And the fourth thing I'd like to do is to present the university librarian, Jim Rettig, to tell you about our accomplished speaker this evening. Jim?
Thank you, Margaret. Margaret teaches public speaking, and one of the lessons is always repeat things so that the audience absorbs it. So I'll touch on some of her points once more in case anybody missed anything. Let me repeat Margaret's welcome on behalf of the Friends to the 2002 Pepple Lecture. The Pepple Lecture was established in 1989 to honor Dr. Edward Pepple and Mrs. Mary Pepple, and we're pleased they're here down in front with us tonight with members of their family. A member of the Richmond class of 1932, returned to Richmond 5 years later to teach in the English department until his retirement in 1978. We do invite you to join the Friends and support the important work of the library through the Friends. We welcome new members and we welcome contributions, if you're so moved, to the Pepple Lecture and Endowment Fund. Membership brochures and information about the Pepple Lecture will be available during the reception afterwards. That'll be in Keller Hall, just across the street and a ways down the block. Back in September, I attended a meeting of academic department chairs and others, and during that meeting, the group discussed the various departmental budgets that support guest lecturers. If you're in an organization that holds lots of meetings, you probably know that many of them end without measurable accomplishments. Not so this particular meeting. You could even say that it had an O. Henry ending. The group discussed the value of sharing information about plans to bring speakers to campus so that departments could collaborate on funding or in other ways to make sure that the university community has the opportunity to hear the best minds speaking on the topics on which they're authorities. Everyone said, yes, that's a good thing to do. As the meeting broke up, I suggested to the chairs of the English and the history departments that perhaps their departments and the Friends could collaborate some year to bring a distinguished speaker to campus for the Pepple Lecture. That was when the meeting produced measurable results. Professor U. West of the history department suggested that the Douglas Southall Freeman visiting professor who would be on campus spring semester 2002 would be an ideal speaker for the Friends of the Library. He gave me the name of Bertram Wyatt-Brown, and reference librarian at heart that I'll always be. I looked him up in databases and books, and I found very positive things there about him, shared that with the Friends, and they asked me to invite him, and he accepted the invitation to be our speaker. Professor Wyatt-Brown is the Richard J. Milbauer Professor of History at the University of Florida. His other honors are numerous, among them being the immediate past president of the Southern Historical Association. He's published extensively. His Southern Honor, Ethics and Behavior in the Old South, published in 1982, was nominated for both the Pulitzer Prize and the American Book Award. It won the Jefferson Davis Memorial Award given by the Museum of the Confederacy here in Richmond. It received high praise in the New York Times Book Review from noted Lincoln biographer David Herbert Donald. Other books, including The Shaping of Southern Culture, Honor, Grace, and War, published 2001, examine the foundations of Southern ideals, conventions, and outlook. His studies of Walker Percy's family, the House of Percy, and the literary Percys have also touched on the themes of honor, melancholy, and creative art. His forthcoming Hearts of Darkness, Wellsprings of a Southern Literary Tradition, traces the interrelationship of regional letters and the emotional difficulties that authors have had to surmount. Tonight, he will touch on many of these deep-running themes as they relate to the life and work of William Sidney Porter, a regional author who had to surmount not just emotional difficulties, but also significant financial and legal difficulties. The Friends of Boatwright Library are honored that Dr. Wyatt-Brown has chosen this occasion for his only public lecture on campus during his semester in residence. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to this year's PEPL lecturer, Dr. Bertram Wyatt-Brown.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful opening. It's just been a wonderful experience here in Richmond. My wife and I are up here on Bostwick Lane in a very snug little cottage, and we have the benefits of the very rich cultural life here in Richmond. Coming from Florida, it's just like a cornucopia to us. You know, it's really a wonderful experience, and we've enjoyed very much the fellowship we've had in the Department of History and American Studies and the English Department. Tonight, I would like also to thank the Pebbles for this very, very good occasion and the honor of being one of the Pebble lecturers. I have the title of O. Henry, Little Shop Girl's Sad Night, Southern Humor, Duplicity, and Melancholy. I begin with a little poem, or doggerel, by Rachel Lindsay about O. Henry. And be it said, amid his prank so odd, with something nigh to chivalry he trod, and oft the drear and driven would defend the little shop girl's night unto the end. Well, short story writers are scarcely much in demand today, with a few exceptions, such as the late Peter Taylor, another Virginian in part. Only well-known novelists, first publishers, fine publishers, to bring their briefer work to public notice. A century ago, however, fiction quickly read was a prime source of entertainment. Few practitioners then were more popular than O. Henry. His prolific, sometimes side-splitting work is now largely consigned to elementary school classrooms and reduced to The Gift of the Magi or some other tale or two. 100 years ago, as Rachel Lindsay pointed out in the verse, the ordinary urban then were more popular than O. Henry. His prolific, sometimes side-splitting work is now largely consigned to elementary school classrooms and reduced to The Gift of the Magi or some other tale or two. 100 years ago, as Rachel Lindsay pointed out in the verse, the ordinary urban reader taking the trolley downtown to work enjoyed O. Henry's short sketches, particularly the ones dealing with the ironies of life in New York City. Today, the TV sitcom about the comic struggles, usually of young people, takes the place of such fare. But O. Henry's own biography and its relationship to his fiction is probably more interesting than the lives of the anonymous scriptwriters for multi-million-dollar Friends, or my wife's and my own favorites, Scrubs, and the occasion of Max Bickford. In preparing a book entitled Hearts of Darkness, I was drawn to the life and work of William Sidney Porter, to use O. Henry's real name. The book proposes that chronic depression has marked the character of Southern letters from Edgar Allan Poe to Richmond's own Ellen Glasgow. Another study, Melancholy's Children, I hope will follow. It too will treat the same phenomenon of combined emotional despair and literary ingenuity, as if one were dependent on the other. Actually, if time permitted, we could discuss three Southern humorists, all of whom adopted pseudonyms and suffered from severe depression, and yet fended off the Blue Devils, as the malady was often called, by writing in a humorous vein. The other two are Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, Uncle Remus, Joel Chandler Harris. All three writers were born and reared in the South, but reacted in varying degrees of intensity about their roots. All three developed the carapace of a second personality under another name to hide their uncertainty about their original selves. William Sidney Porter, however, more than the other two, sought a literary dualism for a very special reason that neither Twain nor Harris had to accommodate. His past cried out for prevarication. But here are a few facts before we reach that point in his life. Born in 1862, Porter grew up to receive the customary inculcation into the rituals and ideology of the lost cause, a prescription that all white Southerners had to adopt. After the war, his place of birth, Greensboro, North Carolina, was a center for the state's Reconstruction experiment under the stern but honest rule of novelist, judge, and Republican carpetbagger Albion Tourget. Algernon Sidney Porter, M.D., O. Henry's father, was christened with a name distinguished in the annals of British liberty. He had, however, become a hopeless drunk, a problem his son would also develop. Nowadays, we would suspect that Dr. Porter's troubles arose from post-traumatic stress disorder, or battle fatigue, as it was called in the Second World War, or shell shock in the First Great War. Algernon Porter had been a Confederate surgeon at a military hospital. Amid chaos, blood, appendages tossed aside, the physician had amputated scores of limbs to prevent gangrene. The sights and smells might have been too much. After the war, Dr. Porter often crept out to a shed back of his house. He would lock the door and pretend to be at work on some marvelous invention. Among them were a flying machine, a steam-run carriage, a mechanical cotton picker, and a perpetual motion contraption. Much of the time, though, he was holding communion with a bottle or a potion of laudanum. His medical practice dwindled away. Money for the family was always short. Making matters worse, William Sidney Porter's mother, Mary Jane Virginia Swaim, died from consumption when he was only 4 years old. With Porter's father seldom on the premises, household management fell to the doctor's mother, a formidable lady, but also to his sister, Elvina Porter, unmarried. She ruled with a proverbial iron fist. In frequent fits of anger, Aunt Lena swore like a besotted sailor. She ran a private elementary school next to the house. Once, when a student was fleeing hysterically from her fury, she halted his exit with a carefully aimed brickbat. She kept a bundle of switches near her desk, and they were often in flailing use. Under the circumstances, William Sidney Porter, her nephew, survived her harsh regime rather well. He altered the spelling of his middle name in 1898, adding the Y instead of the I to add English distinctiveness and to further distance himself from a past that he did not wish to remember. He also claimed a birth date of 1867 by then, 5 years later than his actual one. By that means, he sought further to hide his identity and wipe out memories of a later difficult period in his life. But Porter's childhood was not at all gloomy. Aunt Lena was a fervent reader of literature. She insisted that her charges should delight in the practice as much as she did. Of course, the canonical list was thoroughly Southern and included the obligatory array of Sir Walter Scott's novels and the lugubrious lost cause poems of Father Abram Ryan. Aunt Lena shared her nephew's love of cats and named his newly born barn pets as Dink, Dank, Dunk, Link, Lank, Lunk, Spink, Spank, Spunk. With a twinkle, Aunt Lena no doubt was being whimsical about Latin conjugations. At 20, in March 1882, Porter left his job at the local pharmacy. He set out to make his fortune in Texas. Porter considered journalism his primary occupation. Nevertheless, he had to take on other jobs to survive. In Austin, Texas, the state capital. In 1887, 35-year-old Porter eloped with 17-year-old Athol Estes Roach. 2 years later, his child bride gave birth to Margaret Worth. By then, he and a partner were publishing a magazine called The Rolling Stone. Unfortunately, this Rolling Stone's wit and originality won too few subscribers. As a result, Porter took up bank telling to feed the family. But the bank in question was in deep trouble. An early Enron case, you might say. Porter found himself charged with embezzlement. Hyder Rollins, a Austin, Texas compatriot and noted Renaissance scholar, recalled years later, the affairs of the bank were managed so loosely that Porter's predecessor was driven to retirement. His successor attempted suicide. In any event, Porter had foolishly cooked the books to cover his purloining cash to play the cotton futures. In actuality, all his life, Porter was unable to manage money. He was constantly short and in dire need of loans from friends and publishers. Porter received a subpoena in Houston, where he was then working for a newspaper. He was supposed to return to Austin for the trial. On the appointed day, however, he hopped a train to New Orleans in the opposite direction, and from there sped on to Central America. As he ruefully recognized later, his flight had to be the height of lunacy. After finishing Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim, he later mourned that he had much in common with the tragic figure. I am like Lord Jim because we both made one fatal mistake at the supreme crisis of our lives, a mistake from which we could never recover. While on the run, Porter secretly kept in touch with his family and a rancher friend, Lee Hall, back in Austin. As a result, he learned the tragic news that his wife was dying of tuberculosis. The couple had already lost their second child, so that their daughter Margaret was their only offspring. Athol had taken refuge with the Hall family. Porter hurried back from Honduras, devastated by the disorder he had caused and his wife's impending death. For a few remaining months, he nursed her as best he could while consulting his lawyers about the impending ordeal before the bench. After Athol's death in July 1897, Porter had to face the inevitable. The trial jury found him guilty. His sentence was to serve 5 years in a federal penitentiary. He had worked at a national bank. The authorities shipped him to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus, a huge, grim medieval fortress which apparently housed felons convicted under federal laws. The effect on his former gregarious personality was almost immediate. He exercised considerable self-control and became extremely tight-lipped as a prisoner. In later years, his daughter Margaret explained that his extreme reserve was not shyness, but, quote, a passionate desire to be wholly and only himself, against the intrusion of more aggressive personalities. An invisible barrier was erected. He used words, Margaret wrote, as a barrage of sound, protecting the innermost silences of self. When once asked what he thought of the hereafter, he replied lightly, I had a little dog. His name was Rover, and when he died all over. Feeling the disgrace as only an honor-conscious Southerner might, Porter often expressed in letters home his desire for a quick and even self-inflicted death. Yet life behind bars was not as unwholesome for him as it could have been. By the prison standards of the day, Porter, number 30664, sustained an enviable tenure. His duties as the prison hospital's night pharmacist for the 2,500 prisoners kept him from the violence of the regular cells. Nonetheless, what he saw and experienced there nearly drove him, as he said, nearly to suicide. He wrote his dead wife's mother in 1898 how the prisoners were, quote, regarded as animals without soul or feeling. The majority faced slow death from overwork, while suicides were as common as picnics. Denied the ordinary diversions, they cut their throats and hang themselves and stop up their cells and turn on the gas. I often get as blue as anyone can get, and I feel as thoroughly miserable as it is possible to feel. Yet his privileged job and the time it allowed for uninterrupted writing did not erase his deep sense of shame. Dr. John M. Thomas, his boss as prison physician, recalled that in handling over 10,000 inmates in his 8 years of tenure there, he had never known a man who was so deeply humiliated by his prison experience as O. Henry. Porter had every reason to draw an impenetrable veil over this part of his life and never to speak of it publicly. With his literary abilities, Porter could have reported the inhumanity of the inmates and guards with vivid illustrations of the degradations that he'd learned about. When fellow prisoners urged him to expose the horrors of penitentiary life, he exclaimed, I tell you, I will not attempt to bring a remedy to this diseased soul of society. I will forget I ever breathed behind these walls. It was the reaction of an emotionally bruised, conservative Southerner, and not that of a Yankee journalist reformer. Instead, Porter assumed the facade of the model prisoner. He never complained, never spoke out. He made only a few friends among the ranks of prisoners. Porter did, however, befriend a 17-year-old boy named Kidd, whose swimming companion had accidentally drowned in the Scioto River of Ohio. On the slimmest of evidence, the possibly retarded teenager was charged with murder, sentenced, and scheduled for electrocution. Porter and his only friend, Al Jennings, witnessed the fatal scene. The warden approached the boy as he sat quivering in the chair, the electrode sticking to his shaved head and bare legs. "Confess, kid," yelled the warden. It took some time for the frightened victim to understand, but at last he said quietly, "I ain't guilty. I never killed him." At once, the warden threw the lever. The body jumped, wriggled, fell back, like a piece of barbed wire vibrates out when it's suddenly cut from a fence. Porter burned with indignation that a jury could convict an innocent boy and have him put to death. Yet he never fictionalized such prison experiences. Comedy, not sad reflection or representations of hideous realities, would be his literary aim. But what memories he had to suppress. By the use of his humorous side, by a studied honesty as a pharmacist in charge of drugs, and by his repression of emotions, Porter stayed out of trouble. Thus, in 1901, he was enabled to win freedom after a little over 3 years. Most of Porter's life, after the prison doors slammed behind him, was spent in New York. Yet while most of his work concerned life in the urban North, he never lost his Southern accent and remained at heart a Southerner in exile. In his fiction, he observed a world of pain and sorrow, but colored it all in palatable fictional surprise. Deliberately, Porter repressed his shattered idealism and fled in imagination from any deep questioning about the human condition. He played the part of the sympathetic observer. He was never a moralizer, a temptation to which Mark Twain sometimes succumbed. Settling in New York in 1902, Porter found he could be as anonymous as he could ever hope for. There he presented himself to the world and strangers as O. Henry. Under that guise, few people would learn of his past. One of his earliest and funniest accounts did, however, concern Southern life. Written in Texas long before his indictment and incarceration, it was called Verryton Villa, A Tale of the South. Indeed, his other Texas stories were very much in the Southwestern style of humor and exaggeration. The narrator of Verryton Villa is a Boston schoolmarm who smugly claims an intimate knowledge of Southern culture and habits from having read Harriet Beecher Stowe and other Yankee authors like Albion Tourget, the Republican judge in Porter's Greensboro, and author of the popular Reconstruction novel A Fool's Errand. With a straight face, O. Henry declares in Verryton Villa, everyone living in the South will recognize the accurate portraits of Southern types of character in this story. Penelope Cook, the northern visitor, leaves the Houston station driven by an old freedman who suddenly bursts into tears. A broken trace chain reminds him of Massa Lincoln and what in heaven. Piously, the abolitionist Bostonian replies, "Pete, do not weep. In the mansions blessed above, your godlike liberator awaits you." Overtaken by her soothing kindness, he sobs into her lap. Penelope is obliged to drive the pair of desiccated mules up to the plantation house. The disciplinary instrument is in the... They arrive just as another mule is shooed out of the front door with a broom. The disciplinary instrument is in the hands of the aristocratic Mrs. DeVere, whose diamond-bedecked bosom, Grecian features, snowy white hair, and black satin dress identify her as the allegedly typical Southern matron. While the mule takes its ease on the veranda, the dignified old lady receives the newcomer with customary Southern hospitality, but warns her to stay clear of that damn mule. I can't keep him out of the house. The interior furnishings are well appointed, but signs of decay and sloth soon become evident. A wheelbarrow with long dried mortar occupies a place in the parlor, while some chickens roost on the piano. Somebody's pants hangs from the central chandelier. In the sketch, Aubrey DeVere, the young and handsome son and heir, a mere 7 feet tall, graciously steps forward in an expensive suit in the latest fashion. His eyes were immense, dark, and filled with haunting sadness, and his pale patrician features, an air of haute monde, stamped him at once as a descendant of a long line of aristocrats. But his savoir-faire is somewhat tarnished by the absence of shoes. Underneath the fancy dress coat, he displays his underwear, offset by an enormous scintillating diamond attached with his piece of twine to the inner garment. Tobacco juice streams down the side of his face. When the naive Penelope says something unpleasant about Jefferson Davis, Aubrey flies into a rage. He seizes a clucking chicken, unfortunate enough to be strutting by, and wrings its neck. It flops about headless, spilling blood all over the delicate Brussels carpet. Aubrey cries out, "That is the South, the bleeding and dying South after Gettysburg." Furious, he pitches the chicken's head into the schoolteacher's face. Then in immediate remorse, he falls to one knee before her, lugubriously begging forgiveness. Aubrey explains that 28 years earlier, his daddy had died during the Battle of Shiloh. At dinner, the main course is the hapless chicken. Once again, Aubrey erupts in savage fury. He drives the carving knife into the breast of Pete, the black servant. The freedman has spilled a spot of gravy on the damask tablecloth. Penelope rushes to her carriage driver's side and hears his dying whisper, "Goodbye, Missy. I hear the angels singing, and I sees the blessed Mars Abraham Lincoln smile at me and near the great white throne. Later on, Aubrey's anger flares up once again when Penelope refuses his grotesque advances. He hurls her through a plate glass window, followed by an avalanche of parlor furniture, including the piano. She faints and awakens in her own bed with a once more repentant Aubrey nursing her. Shortly afterwards, Cyrus, her fiancé from Boston, arrives, but the household is greeted by a party of masked men. They rush in to lynch a damn Yankee, who they had heard had been skulking about. But Aubrey dispatches the intruders with a heavy table leg wrenched free of its supportive responsibilities. Thus, he shields the family honor as a host, whose duty requires him to protect his guests. At the train station, where Cyrus and Penelope await the train for reaching Boston, Aubrey settles himself on a keg of blasting powder and blows himself to smithereens. His big toe lands in Penelope's lap as the train pulls out. The appendage becomes a poignant memento of her sojourn in the overly impulsive and slothful South. We're told that thereafter she holds it as a keepsake in a bottle of alcohol next to her bed. Well, much of Porter's humor took a similar pattern. Unexpected distortions of probability, pratfalls, malapropisms, plays of language and dialect, southwestern tall tale exaggeration, and an irony that seldom was as acerbic as Twain's. This early satire was not simply to mock one side of the sectional conflict against the other. Brereton Villa may be read not merely as a spoof on northern misconceptions about southern life, but also as a critique of the South itself, with its myths of wealth, ease, impeccable manners, and defensive lost cause preoccupations. He offers so much attention to the violent whims of Aubrey de Vere that Penelope, the abolitionist storyteller, becomes more observer than object of derision. Such stories as the duplicity of Hargraves belong in the same Southern Cavalier tradition. Planters had always loved to laugh at such pretensions, even as they upheld the heroic cult back in the Old South days. Written in the Ohio prison, June 1900, Hargraves appeared in Munsey's magazine in New York. It was among the first stories bearing the name of O. Henry as author. Hargraves earned the unknown author the meager sum of $60. Showing a greater acuteness and maturity than his Texas parody, gently Porter lampoons Major Pendleton Talbot of Mobile, Alabama. In fact, like Joel Chandler Harris, Porter also made his contribution to the stereotyping of the old black cap doffers who felt nostalgic about the good old slavery days. But there's more to it than that. In his worn-out frock coat and little black string tie, Major Talbot, a stiff, honor-obsessed veteran of the late war, and his daughter Lydia reside in a Washington, D.C. boarding house on very slim resources. While writing his memoirs, the Major regales another lodger, a young vaudeville actor named Henry Hopkins Hargraves, with endless stories of bench, bar, and battle. Hargraves seems most respectful and very attentive to every detail. Finding his funds all but exhausted, the Major nonetheless scorns reality and buys 2 tickets for the vaudeville theater. He and Lydia attend, only to discover that Hargraves has reproduced the Major's queer clothes, his antique mannerisms, and stories of former wealth and glory to perfection. The performance wins hearty applause from the audience and rave newspaper reviews. Major Talbot, though, is thoroughly humiliated. In a confrontation with the actor the following day, he resentfully denounced this misappropriation of himself and his habits. Claiming that no disrespect to the Major's honor was intended, Hargraves offers him $300. The actor explains that he knows all about the unsound state of the Talbots' finances. Peremptorily, the Major proudly dismisses the offer entirely. After Hargraves has moved out of the boarding house, an old and slavishly deferential freedman asks to see the aged veteran at his lodgings. Identifying himself as Uncle Mose, the visitor explains that he had worked for the Talbots many years before and had come to repay an old debt. After emancipation, Talbot's grandfather had generously lent him some mules. Mose had prospered so well that now he owns his own land in Nebraska and seeks to make good the long-standing obligation. Touched by the simple honesty of a former and grateful slave, whom he could not actually remember, Talbot graciously accepts the sum of $300. A short time afterward, Lydia receives a note from Hargraves boasting of his success in New York and inquiring, "How did I play Uncle Mose?" Benign though the story is, the actor Hargraves belongs to the venerable and almost universal literary tradition of the trickster. We could view Hargraves as a subversive impostor who deceives the Major not once but twice, while striding the boards as an actor. Like some fictional amoral tricksters in other stories, one might argue, Hargraves is rather unscrupulous in pursuing the acclaim of audiences. It suits his purpose to deceive once again the source of his theatrical success with a second display of his deceptive talents at what for him is a trifling cost of only $300. Even though the object is also to repay the old rebel for Hargraves' first deception, the ultimate cruelty is his hubris in informing the Major's daughter, so that she must thereafter bear the secret alone. Did Porter, however, expect the reader to note Hargraves' unfeeling act as if to say to Lydia, "I'm not interested in you, but look how clever I am"? To be sure, Hargraves is not entirely without principle. He has benefited the father and the daughter. From Porter's point of view, that is not at all what the reader should think. He simply wants no critical probing behind the stated one dimension that he intended. Usually he saw no penetrating response and therefore did not create credible, rounded imaginary figures. In his understanding of the writing craft, plot trumped the arc of character development. Nonetheless, Porter often took up the theme of deception, occasionally with a much more biting and pessimistic tone, suggesting that he had the innate resources for richer work than he actually produced. The Furnished Room tersely relates the story of two callous Irish landladies who gossip downstairs, while the newly arrived young lodger carries out his suicide in the room where the prior occupant had done the same, without his, of course, knowing anything of it. This powerful sketch and the still grimmer The Enchanted Kiss were among Porter's more realistic, astringent stories. The Furnished Room was appreciated abroad more than it was in this country. Stephen Laycock, the English humorist, declared that in it, O. Henry had surpassed Guy de Maupassant, the famous French story writer of the same era. In contrast to the life O. Henry led and the lives in the streets he observed, he was no realist in his fiction. In this respect, he was true to his romantic Southern heritage. He could even be sometimes sentimental about the South. He knew as an apprentice pharmacist at that Greensboro store. There, old-timers, including his bibulous father, had sat around a pot-bellied stove and whiled away the lazy hours. Surprisingly, a cynical streak sometimes appears in his more serious work. In The Plutonian Fire, for example, he has a young aspiring writer from Alabama try his fortune in the brisk, cutthroat world of journalism in New York City. He had enjoyed literary success in hometown papers, largely because he was, quote, the son of the gallant Major Pettingill Pettit, our former county attorney general and hero of the Battle of Lookout Mountain. The young writer tries his hand at lengthy, Scott-like medieval love stories set in Picardy, 1289. At night, though, he discovers New York's bars and beans, only 10 cents. Inspired by an encounter with a gorgeous New York girl, he scribbles down a story called Suffering Sappho. The narrator of the story judges it, quote, sentimental drivel, full of whimpering soft-heartedness and gushing egotism. The magazines wouldn't take it. To crown his failure, Pettit's girl jilts him. The suffering writer moans about taking prussic acid or fleeing to South America, like Porter himself. An evening of whiskey swings him around, however, and he begins again to compose a new story feverishly. Another young woman falls in love with him, but this time he rejects her rather than the reverse, and she nearly commits suicide. The story reveals her reactions and troubles. That is the story he's writing. This new effort at last wins an editor's high praise. He promises him contracts and good pay. Yet Pettit tears the pages of his masterpiece and bitterly rejoins, I see the game now. You can't write with ink, and you can't write with your heart, with your own heart's blood, but you can write with the heart's blood of someone else. You have to be a cad before you can be an artist. He goes to his Alabama home to sell plows for his father. Porter may have felt a little bit like that himself in his own career, which was then coming to a close. In Porter's last 3 years, he grew aware of his declining health and worried about his creative legacy. His fame was then at its height. Yet spendthrift habits and poor remuneration for his stories kept him close to insolvency. Behind that downcast attitude about the monetary value of his work lay Porter's own devaluation of his stories' literary worth. In 1909, he bitterly announced, my stories? No, they don't satisfy me. It depresses me to have people point out or introduce me as the celebrated author. It seems such a big label for such a picayune set of goods. Yet Porter was a dazzling storyteller. He drew his materials from his sense of alienation itself, hidden below the surface and transformed into sunnier art. He spent his time away from his desk and his pen, bumming through the sleazier parts of New York, or indeed wherever he happened to be. Dr. D. Daniels, an acquaintance from Porter's Austin days, recalled how the writer had never cared for the so-called higher classes. Instead, he roamed the bars, the casinos, brothels, and downtown streets where the homeless and the poor prowled about. I've seen the most ragged specimen of a bum hold up Porter, who would always do anything he could for the man, Daniels reported. No doubt, Porter's time in prison further helped to shape his contrasting attitudes towards the rich and the poor. Yet even as he despised the seedy Southern aristocracy, such as it was, and the Yankee moneybags, he could not shake off the culture in which he was raised. Despite his extraordinary oral and literary talents, he never slipped away from the gentlemanly code to pass along a dirty joke. In his stories, he seldom exposed the full extent of misery and penury in the lives of the lower classes with whom he consorted in the real world. Toward the end of his life, he turned from depictions of urban society in the North to settings in his homeland. Uppermost on his mind was a project for Collier's Weekly, a serial on Southern life and identity. It was a subject he had not treated very much in his enormous output of over 600 stories, only 30 of which were set in the South. Porter planned to contrast two types of white Southerners. The first were the money-driven New South go-getters and town boosters. The other sort, who needed unmasking in his opinion, that was the type of professional Southerner who was still trying to blame all his troubles on the Civil War. Partly responsible for this turn towards his homeland was his marriage in 1907 to Sarah Coleman, then 37 when he was 46. He'd known Sarah back in Greensboro so many years before. By wedding Sarah, he hoped perhaps to recapture his youth and above all to gain renewed respectability, not the most promising reasons for marriage. As Porter noted to his friend Al Jennings, Sarah was a high-born, high-bred lady with all the gentility a Southern lady from North Carolina could represent. In fact, Jennings thought Porter very ill-suited for such a union or any marriage, given his nighttime habits, heavy drinking, and moodiness. Even Porter later admitted he had brought all my troubles upon her. Was it right? Her ladylike manners made his New York journalist chums uncomfortable. In truth, Sarah's husband actually preferred their company to hers. Porter's declining health and tensions arising from Sarah's trouble handling stepdaughter Margaret did not create a tranquil home. For her part, the teenager had long since learned that her father's outwardly casual, smiling countenance and twinkling eyes was only one part that he liked to play. When his melancholia seized him, it was like a descending shadow. She wrote he would be plunged into silences, black silences, the portent of which he alone could know. For although there is understanding, it is not humanly possible to accompany one on those dark journeys. Margaret herself felt left out in the cold. Her father used to call her Bill, Jim, or Pete, as if she was one of his drinking buddies. He seldom could convey his love for her in her presence. On their very last meeting before his death, he'd awkwardly mumble something. Finally, to override his embarrassment, she told him, "I have seen and I understand." There flashed across his face, she continued, an expression of inestimable relief and one of his rare smiles. Never exactly sure of who he was or how he felt, Porter fooled his friends and himself about his deteriorating health. He dismissed the gloomier diagnoses of his New York physicians, preferring instead the ignorant ones of a North Carolina sawbones. Nonetheless, he had to confess a lack of progress to his waiting publishers. Admitting to a raging hangover, he wrote one editor, a double day, "I was so much under the weather today that I could not get up to do my work until just now." Without a doubt, deep despair had sped Porter toward the grave. In January 1910, he'd written his friend George Tyler that he was suffering from cirrhosis of the liver, fatty degeneration of the heart, and neurasthenia, the latter being a common term for such symptoms of melancholy as sleeplessness and headaches. The maladies, he joked, made him about as nervous as the hind leg of a frog. Chief among Porter's medical problems was an acute alcoholism. Thanks to the ministrations of the bottle, his productivity declined dramatically in his last years. A friend speculated that the recollection of the dark hours in his earlier life took toll on his resistance. Before he died, 9 empty whiskey bottles were found under the bed in his room at the Caledonia Hotel. Porter's sad memories of the long-dead Athol, flights to Honduras, years in prison, and separation from Margaret left its scars on his sensitive soul, a friend speculated. In fact, Charles Russell Hancock, his last New York doctor, hastened him to the Polyclinic Hospital on East 38th Street when he was perilously ill. Porter was so discomfited by his vulnerability that he insisted on signing the register as Dennis. He dreaded the dishonor of losing control over his own life. Then he changed his mind, and instead of Dennis, he wanted to be called Will S. Parker to retain his initials. Even on the edge of death, he scrambled his identity. Emptying his pockets on the hospital's reception counter, he muttered, "Here I'm going to die and only worth 23 cents." Porter expired in the Polyclinic 4 June 1910. As one of the more inventive of the 19th century practitioners of the short story, he was to have an annual prize for that genre presented in the literary name of O. Henry. And I was just reminded recently today that there's a candy bar by the same name. Whether it's any relation to him, I don't know. Curiously, like him, most of the great 19th century short story experts died very young. Porter himself being only 50. Poe, age 40. Maupassant, 43. Robert Louis Stevenson, 44. Stephen Crane, 29. And Jack London, 40. All died early in life, some of them like Poe and Maupassant, dying insane. All these creative souls were spiritual and sometimes physical exiles from the place of their origin. Although his end was not untypical, O. Henry's death brought a sad conclusion to the life of an artist who might have broken through cultural constraints. He knew himself that he had not gained the sort of literary greatness that a less inhibited soul could have reached. In the short story, The Roads We Take, he produced a character, Bob Tidball, a bandit, soon to be murdered after a train robbery out west. Tidball remarks, "It ain't the roads we take, it's what's inside of us that makes us turn out the way we do." The sentiment fit Porter as well. He had passionately loved New York, but somehow was constantly drawn southward. In his second marriage and his late attempts to record in fiction some of his southern experiences. Ordinarily, quite aware of public expectations, Porter strove in fiction for hopeful, not a cynical or brutal close. Art, he believed, should not represent the life he had known. It should provide instead a means to escape from a chronically untrustworthy and unresponsive social order. Romance was his objective. It promised a measure of hope against fate, adversity, injustice. He would have scoffed at any attempt to over-intellectualize what he'd done. Nonetheless, that superficiality, even as strictly designed to market his fiction, indicated an unstable emotional state, particularly in an author who might have risen to greater literary heights. A Southern protectiveness of his hidden life and a Southern propensity to romanticize had held him close. Nonetheless, Porter cheered the lives of the little shop girl who just had time to finish his latest story before stepping behind the cash register. Thank you. Would you like to have some questions? Fine. Yeah. Anyone? Yeah.
Did he have any journals or notebooks, diaries, or anything like that? Any more personal? Just fiction.
I don't think there's much. There is a museum in Greensboro that's collected as much material as there is. But I don't think he kept a journal, no. And he certainly didn't save, if he did keep one in his prison experience, he didn't hold on to it. He burned it, or maybe he never wrote it in the first place. Instead, everything went into this imaginative vein.
What got you interested in writing about it?
Well, as I say, I was doing this book on the 19th century Southern writers, and so many of them did suffer from this mental illness, which is now becoming much more public in its character. William Styron's written about his own problems of depression, and there have been a number of other books. Kay Redfield Jamison wrote a very fine book about her problems. She's a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins, writes beautifully. Wilfred Sheed, there's a great number of writers today that have sort of come out of the closet, so to speak, of this problem, which always had a terrible stigma attached to it. It was supposed to be, if you committed suicide or if you fell into these periods of gloom, you were thought to be a coward or a moral misfit of some sort, and people would, have less respect. And of course, it is really a very serious mental illness that is both psychological and medical in nature. The feeling is that you can, or the scientists, the neuroscientists, have discovered that there are genes which seem to control this, and it is a matter of the chemistry of the brain. An undersupply of serotonin helps to bring on this kind of illness. So I was interested in the medical side, and of course I'd done this book on the Percy family, which is interesting because Walker Percy's ancestors had suffered from this ever since the 18th century. The problem goes back to the founder of the family in America who committed suicide in 1793, and every generation thereafter there was a suicide in the family until 1929. And there were actually 5 Percy novelists, people with this problem who wrote either about depression or wrote Gothic stories back in the 19th century, as well as Walker himself, of course, whose main characters, heroes, are usually depressives. So I don't know why it interested me, but it's somehow that this connection between creativity and depression is still something of a mystery. We don't know exactly why that is. Plenty of people are depressed and can't write a thing, and I know other people are just not a bit depressed without having much brains, not having the intelligence. What it takes, of course, is a discipline, an ability to detach yourself from this personal experience and convert it into something that other people understand. If it's totally self-indulgence, it's really very boring and probably incoherent too. I've seen some of those as well, and it doesn't work. But those who are able to use their autobiographical experiences imaginatively are the ones who are some of our greatest writers. Dostoevsky, And in music too, of course, Tchaikovsky, George Frederick, Handel, Bach is the only sane musician in the 18th century, I think. So, yes.
What became of Margaret for you? Did she suffer from mental illness?
I think she did. I don't know too much about her except from what the books say, some of these recollections of O. Henry, which I based this piece on. But she was a rather sad character. She and her mother did not get along. And of course, Sarah was the one who inherited the papers and the royalties. And there was a lawsuit about that. And I think that finally she was able to gain something, because I think he died without having signed a will. But she actually had a very sad ending. She was living in California and bought herself a house or cottage in the Sierra Nevadas or somewhere in the mountains. And she was living then with an Englishman named, I've forgotten his name. She was married first to an artist in the Greenwich Village, and that didn't work out. But this second individual, she married the day before she died. She had tuberculosis, and she got this minister to come up and marry them before her death so that he would inherit her property. And also because they'd regularize their life together, which hadn't been all that long. I think they've been together less than a year. But in any case, she wouldn't put on the wedding ring because she knew it would be too difficult to get it off after she died. So she just handed it to him, said, "You can have it now." So I think there was a bit of self-pity in that, perhaps, I'm not sure. But in any case, she's an interesting looking woman. I do have a picture of her, which is, no, I'm afraid I can't show it to you. It's over there. And if you come afterwards, I'll let you have a look at her. She's really quite a remarkable beauty. Died in about 1929 or so. Yes?
Did he return to journalism in any form?
I think he mostly, no, he was actually, in his last days, he wanted to do a musical comedy. And he was going to do that, but he couldn't get started on it. And his whole emotional life and this alcoholism, I think, finally brought him down. His last years were very, very sad. But no, I don't think he went back to journalism. Yeah.
Short stories read very much now at all?
Well, he's certainly not read, he's not talked about at all among literary critics. You won't find a single article on him in the last 20 years, probably. But there have been some recent editions of his early stories, such as this Barrington Villa, which I found in a collection of Texas stories that he did when he was very young. And they're really very easy to talk. You get to reading them, you really get involved. They are quite fun. The plots are great, and the characters are very vivid. But after you can't get too deep into them. There ain't much there.
There's a good film treatment of it too. I don't remember, but there's some well-known people in it. It's an older film. They've done The Last Leaf from Company and several of the better known stories. They've done very well.
Yes, I've heard that. A friend of mine, Al Borowitz in Cleveland, is a lawyer. He writes on this sort of thing, on literary murders. And he said there was this fine movie, but I have never seen it. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much.
Once again, we invite you to the reception over in Keller Hall. Please join us. Thank you.